Hi, it's Rod, and this one's called God's Faith Through Suffering School. It's like this is a how to have faith in God through suffering manual if we want to read it. It says in the Bible that Jesus learned obedience through the things he suffered. It says that Jesus got the greatest rewards in heaven for the things he suffered. We're supposed to follow the example of Jesus and Paul, who suffered a lot. God's trying to teach us how to develop a strong faith in him through suffering, so we can get greatly rewarded for it on our judgment day when we die like Jesus and Paul did. It says in the Bible that we should count it all joy when we're going through sufferings, knowing that it strengthens our faith in God, which can be more valuable to us than gold. It's like if we could see our judgment day now and see how greatly rewarded we got for our sufferings here on earth now and our faith in God through them, we would rejoice more in our sufferings, not let them bother us as much. Believe that this is producing something good going through this. Like the crucifixion of our sinful flesh nature process. Not something bad for us, something good for us. Like it says in the Bible, whom the Lord loves, he painfully disciplines, so that we may share in his holiness more. He sees sin as something that causes us to be a failure, and he sees choosing to obey him as the most successful choice for us. Just like Adam and Eve chose sin against God, God's been trying to train his children to not act like that, act more like Jesus, who obeyed God even though he suffered. We see a lot of suffering in the Bible. We see people like Job suffering and God producing some good out of it for him. Or like Satan sifting Job like wheat, and it was good for him. He learned more about God, more wisdom about God, and his faith in God through suffering grew stronger. We see people like Jeremiah suffering, people going into Babylon slavery suffering, Noah suffering, Lot suffering in Sodom and Gomorrah. Living in an evil and suffering world can cause suffering if you want to be righteous in it. And the good news is we've got to seek God's help to deal with all this stuff. Noah had to have God's help to handle seeing all the evil around him and then watching God judge and punish it with death. But he rejoiced in his own faith in God and salvation, and that's the way we have to do it too. Like Jeremiah, he had to have God helping him, encouraging him through watching Babylon come in and enslave and slaughter wicked Israel. He had to have God's grace to handle wicked Israel not listening to him. And we have to live in an evil and suffering world, and we have to seek God's help to deal with it also. Paul had to put up with persecution. Paul had to go to a rat-infested prison for a couple of years. But with God's help too, he could handle it, and his faith in God could grow stronger through the suffering he was going through. That we have to believe that God is with us. God was with Jeremiah, God was with Job, God was with Noah, God was with Paul or Jesus in suffering to help us through it. It's like we have to hear God's voice prophetically speaking to us in suffering. I lovingly control this. This is something good for you to go through. It can build your faith in me through suffering. I'll greatly reward you for this in heaven. Before we'll say, oh, I don't want to get all fearful and angry about this suffering. I want to believe it's something good for me. And we have to believe that God is like our friend. He's like our best friend. Jesus, King of the universe, with us. He just says to speak a word and the suffering stops, or the suffering starts up. God's got his hand on the thermostat of our suffering. He can turn it up or down, and because he's turning it up doesn't mean he's trying to torture us or something. Because he's turning it up, it might be to get us to turn away from sin and develop a stronger faith in him through suffering. It's like we got to go through a lot of suffering now if we're going to handle the increasing suffering of God's judgment on the wicked coming in the future. Like our flesh needs to go through hell now to want to seek God to crucify it so it doesn't bother us when World War III starts up. If we can't handle the sufferings in our life now, how are we going to handle World War III or famine or economic collapse or something coming? God's got to teach us how to have faith in him to help us in our sufferings now so that we'll have faith in him to help us in our sufferings later when they increase. It's a loving thing for God to put us through suffering and hellish type experiences now and find that he is faithful to help us through them now, so that when we have to go through hellish type experiences in the future, we'll have a strong faith in God to help us to handle it then. It's like the best way to prepare for the judgments on the wicked coming is to develop a good relationship with God now, a strong faith in God now, so that we can be able to handle this judgment coming on the wicked later. And it can be good for us. It can get us greater rewards in heaven for choosing to have faith in God through the maybe Job trials he's putting us through now, or Satan sifting us like wheat trials. Greater sufferings, greater temptations, not to destroy us, to strengthen our faith in God for our good. To get us greater rewards in heaven later. So that we can be like a Noah, not letting it bother us. Noah could have went crazy or something, but with the grace of God, he could handle it. Jeremiah could have went crazy, but with the grace of God, he could handle it. Job could have went crazy, but with the grace of God, he could handle it. Paul could have went crazy, or even Jesus could have went crazy, but God could help them through it, bring good out of it for them, make them happy in it, rejoicing in the trials. This is going to get me great rewards in heaven. Help me have faith in you through this suffering or whatever. It can be better than gold in heaven. Well, it's sort of like, it's like I'm thinking of this movie called It's a Wonderful Life. It's about this guy who went through suffering, and he thought it was just God punishing him or something. But then he met an angel, and the angel tried to help him understand that all the good that was coming out of the suffering, that what his life would be like without the suffering, and what his life was like with the suffering, and his life with the suffering was better than his life without the suffering. And we got to think about that on our judgment day too. Not look at our suffering and say, oh, I must have failed or something. God didn't make me rich and healthy or something. Didn't have enough faith in him to live an easy life or something. Like the false faith movement doctrine. The real doctrine is you learn obedience through suffering. And the Job type experience is good for you. So it's like a wonderful life judgment day. It's like those who suffered the most and still had faith in God get the greatest rewards in heaven, suffering love awards in heaven. And it's like when we get to heaven, it's like we'll be talking about who loved Jesus the most in heaven or something. We'll be sitting around heaven saying, well, Jesus put me through this Job trial type experience, or Jesus let Satan sift me like wheat, but I had faith in him through it. And everybody will be delighting in the faith of the saints, I guess. Here's Job, great career, great rewards in heaven. Here's Noah, great rewards, great careers in heaven. Here's Jesus, the greatest rewards, the greatest career in heaven. Following the example of Jesus, who let God put him through suffering trials, the crucifixion of his flesh, yet he still had faith in God through it. Jesus went through more suffering than we'll ever go through for all the sins of mankind, but yet he still had faith in God to produce something good out of it. We need to hear God say things to us like, in suffering, I lovingly control this. This is good for you to go through. I'll greatly reward you in heaven for it. And not just listen to Satan saying, God can't be good if you're suffering, and it's because you're a bad person, you're suffering like this. No, if you're a good person, you're going to suffer a lot, persecution and other things, temptation and everything, for your faith through suffering training, like God's faith through suffering training school. And it's like, if you could see the rewards you'll get for this, having faith in God through terrible sufferings on earth, if you could see the career you'll get in heaven for being a good and faithful servant through suffering circumstances and building your faith in God through them, you look like Jesus on the earth or Paul on the earth or something. Suffering didn't destroy your faith in God, it made it stronger. Count it all joy when you're suffering, when you're going through suffering or temptation and you still have faith in God. It's building a greater faith in God for building greater rewards in heaven. So that the suffering doesn't bother you. This is good for you. I control it. I'll reward you for it. I like what you're doing, having faith in me through this suffering circumstance. Not apostatizing in it. So like I said, we're going to go into greater sufferings in the future: economic collapse, famine, rioting, apostasy, World War III. But it doesn't have to bother us. We can rejoice in the faith-building experiences with suffering getting greater in the future. We can rejoice in God putting us through suffering circumstances now to prepare us for it, like Job-type bridal trials now. It's like what God tells me about the future. It looks something like this vision he gave me. I was on a beach, and there was a great big storm going on, and like tornadoes out on the water and everything. And I looked around, and I seen women weeping by the shoreline, and babies drowned in the water, and people starving around fire barrels, like hobos or something. And I looked at Jesus and I said, what's this about? And Jesus said to me, now it's time to preach and do miracles. So that kind of means to me that when everything gets really bad around me, there's a hope that Jesus wants to go out and help people when they're like in a prodigal sons of pig pen, when they're sick and poor and dying in the future. Not that the sickness, poverty, and death is going to bother me. It doesn't bother Jesus. He controls it all. Jesus ain't bothered by World War III, neither should I be. Like this vision I had. I was talking to Jesus, and I asked him the question, what does the future look like, Jesus? And he said, economic collapse, famine, rioting, apostasy, and World War III. And I started to think, that doesn't sound like too good of a future to think about. Then all of a sudden it turns into a vision of me dancing with Jesus around World War III. There's tanks, there's people shooting each other, there's dead bodies on the ground. I look to Jesus when I'm dancing with him and I try to say, what's this about? And Jesus looks at me and he says, don't let it bother you, Rod. I control this. You've got to believe that no matter how bad the suffering gets on the earth, days of Noah, Sodom and Gomorrah fire, Jesus controls it all. King of the universe living in you. Super God power in you. In all these visions I have, Jesus is calm as a cucumber. I'm looking at terrible suffering circumstances, worried about it. He's telling me, you're safe with me. Don't let it bother you, Ron. This could be good for your faith-building experience. Because it's faith in him, not me. If it was faith in me, I'd be all worried about it. Like sometimes I see this vision of Jesus next to the TV set, and it's like World War III's on the TV set. And he's standing there saying, don't let this stuff bother you, Rod. I control it. We got to hear God's prophetic voice. The Lord's my shepherd. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. He's here. He's like saying, I'm here. I'll comfort you. I'll help you. Jesus in us can handle all this. Jesus in us could handle the days of Noah part 2. Jesus in us could handle the Antichrist world with the mark of the beast, tribulation. He doesn't want us fearing this stuff. He wants us having faith in him to help us through this stuff and bring good out of it for us, so that as we do what he tells us to do in the suffering world around us, with faith in him to help us through it, we head for a great judgment day with great rewards and great careers like he got for trusting in God through this evil and suffering world, through building his faith up through suffering in this kind of school, training school on earth for that. So it's like a faith through suffering school. Like Jesus learned obedience through the things he suffered, we got to learn obedience through the things we suffer, and we don't do this alone. Jesus didn't do it alone. He had God's help to do it. We don't do it alone. We got Jesus and God's help to do it. It could be a very dangerous world because of sin and evil people and evil spirits. But we put our eyes on good God. King of the universe is here. He's good. It's like you can either choose put all your eyes on the evil world, like the TV set or internet or something like that, the news. Or you can put your eyes on awesome, good God who's here, King of the universe, best friend Jesus, and not be bothered by it. Don't let it bother you, Rod. I control it. I can bring good out of this for you. Maybe Job was hearing God's voice saying, I control this. I can bring good out of it for you. Keep having faith in me, Job. That's what we need to hear, God encouraging us through these suffering circumstances, so we can develop a stronger faith in God through suffering in this God's faith through suffering training school we're living in. And then get greatly rewarded for it, sort of like a report card day, judgment day. How much faith did you have in me through suffering, Rod? Let's look, check it out, A+. Give them the rewards, give them a great career. We're working towards a great career in heaven. God needs good leaders in heaven, and he tries to develop them through suffering experiences now to try to help them to become good and faithful servants of him now, who can be good and faithful leaders in his heavenly kingdom or the new earth in the future. But if we don't trust in God and we don't go through this faith through suffering school, we're not going to have a good judgment day when we die and get great rewards and great careers. So like a leadership in heaven training school through suffering experiences with the help of God to get through them, our faith in God through suffering teacher Jesus, and then get greatly rewarded for it after we die. So we may be going through a lot of suffering right now. May it help us to get closer to God, learn the lessons he wants to teach us, so we can have a strong faith in him through them now. And as things increase, God's grace can increase. We can have God visit us and tell us, don't let this World War III bother you. I control it. I'll help you through it. I'll bring good out of it for you. I'll make you happy in it. You can dance with me around it. Where you're trusting in God, not you, who controls everything. Jesus could just speak a word, the storm stops, or he can feed 5,000 people, raise the dead. He can feed people in the wilderness for 40 years like children of Israel. Nothing too difficult for Jesus to do. He owns all the gold in heaven and earth. He can say to you something like, don't worry about money I'm buying. I'll supply for you. You are my sheep, you shall not want. I will take good care of you. It's putting your faith in God through suffering circumstances now, so that you'll be able to handle even worse suffering circumstances coming in the future through the faith in God through suffering you learn now. With the hope of, this is going to get me greatly rewarded in heaven, having faith in God through this suffering, fighting Satan, saying off, God can't be good if you're suffering. Yes, he can, Satan. It's supposed to be a suffering school. And God's supposed to help me through it and bring good out of it for me and make me happy in it and help me not to be bothered by it. So that's what we need to understand about God's faith through suffering school.